Late February 1945. The war in Europe is entering its final, brutal phase. American armored divisions push deep into German territory, encountering resistance that grows more desperate and more dangerous with each passing day. In a small village, west of Cologne, 5 American tank crew members face a decision that will define their lives. Their enemy, a 70-ton fortress of steel considered invincible by every tactical manual written. Their choice: follow doctrine and fail the mission, or attempt something no training manual ever anticipated. This is the story of courage born not from confidence, but from necessity, of mathematics shattered by determination, of 5 men who understood the odds perfectly and chose to ignore them. The M4 Sherman tank represented American armored philosophy perfectly: build many rather than build the best. Produce reliability over superiority. Win through numbers, not individual performance. By early 1945, nearly 50,000 Shermans had rolled from American factories. The tank could be manufactured quickly, shipped across oceans, maintained by crews with modest training, and kept running under harsh field conditions. The improved E8 variant, known as the Easy 8, mounted a 76mm gun. Frontal armor measured just over 60mm on the hull, slightly more on the turret. Weight, 33 tons. Maximum speed, nearly 40 kilometers per hour. American doctrine never intended Shermans to fight enemy heavy tanks directly. That job belonged to specialized tank destroyers with bigger guns. Shermans existed for infantry support, exploitation, pursuit. Mobile firepower, not tank dueling. But doctrine meets reality differently in combat. By 1945, American tank crews had learned brutal lessons across France and into Germany. Sometimes you couldn't wait for tank destroyers. Sometimes the enemy appeared at ranges where retreat was impossible. Sometimes mission requirements demanded engagement regardless of odds. The crews adapted. They learned weak points on German armor. They coordinated attacks from multiple angles. They called for air support when possible. They survived through creativity when firepower proved inadequate. But creativity has limits when facing what the Germans called the Königstiger. The Panzer VI and Model B, the King Tiger, represented German engineering philosophy at its extreme. Build the best weapon possible. Prioritize individual superiority over every other consideration. Create dominance through technological excellence. 70 tons of steel. Frontal armor, 180mm thick on the turret, 100mm on the hull, both sloped for maximum effectiveness. Main armament, an 88mm gun with a barrel, over 6 meters long, capable of penetrating any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. German propaganda emphasized invincibility, and this time the propaganda contained substantial truth. No Allied tank gun could reliably penetrate King Tiger frontal armor. American 76mm rounds, British 17-pounders, Soviet 85mm guns, all bounced off or shattered against armor designed to defeat them. The psychological impact was enormous. King Tiger crews fought with justified confidence. Allied crews approached these encounters with justified dread. Intelligence reports made certain everyone understood exactly how outmatched they were, yet the King Tiger embodied critical flaws. Massive weight created chronic mechanical problems. Transmissions and final drives constantly failed. Fuel consumption was catastrophic at a time when Germany's petroleum situation had collapsed. Production remained minimal, fewer than 500 manufactured during the entire war. By late February 1945, surviving King Tigers operated with reduced crews, insufficient fuel, limited ammunition, and no hope of replacement or repair. Strategic defeat was certain, but tactical superiority remained intact. A King Tiger with ammunition and a functioning gun could still dominate any engagement, destroying multiple enemy tanks before circumstances rendered it immobile. This created the paradox. Facing a weapon you couldn't defeat through conventional means, but couldn't bypass, crewed by desperate professionals who understood Germany had lost but would defend their position with a tank capable of killing anything within range. Sergeant John Roller joined the army in late 1942. Processed through Fort Knox, where armoured training emphasised speed and coordination over individual tank combat. The doctrine was clear. Tanks exploit breakthroughs, support infantry, pursue defeated enemies. Tank versus tank fighting would be exceptional, not typical. Reality proved different. By February 1945, Roller's crew had survived the Normandy breakthrough, the race across France, the grinding advance into Germany's industrial heartland. 6 weeks of continuous combat operations, sleeping in or near their tank, maintaining equipment under field conditions, engaging in close-range urban fighting where German defenders utilized every advantage. Lieutenant Harold Borer, 23, tank commander, survivor of Normandy, responsible for tactical decisions that meant life or death for 5 men. Corporal William McVeigh, gunner, responsible for the 76mm gun that represented their primary offensive weapon. Private First Class James Farn, loader, working in confined turret space, maintaining rate of fire during engagements. Corporal Eugene Roberts, bow gunner and assistant driver, operating the hull machine gun, helping navigate. And Roller himself, driver, responsible for maneuvering 33 tons of steel through terrain that ranged from open fields to narrow village streets. These weren't the fresh crews who landed in Normandy. 6 weeks of continuous combat changes, men. They were exhausted in ways peacetime training never prepares soldiers for. Sleep came in brief intervals. Hot meals were irregular. The psychological strain of watching other crews die, knowing each engagement might be their last, that creates cumulative stress that degrades judgment and increases error rates. Their ammunition situation illustrated broader problems. The tank carried 33 rounds for the main gun, less than half capacity. Only 4 were special high-velocity armor-piercing rounds with tungsten cores, capable of penetrating heavier armor. The rest, standard rounds adequate against medium tanks, high-explosive shells for soft targets. Those 4 special rounds might penetrate King Tiger side armor at close range, perhaps 200 meters or less, striking at 90-degree angles. Frontal engagement remained mathematically impossible. The King Tiger's frontal armor would defeat their ammunition regardless of range or angle. Doctrine was clear. Radio contact reports, withdraw to covered positions, wait for support from heavier guns. But what if withdrawal meant mission failure? What if support wasn't available? What if the schedule demanded immediate action? The King Tiger blocking the village road belonged to Heavy Tank Battalion 506, a unit nearly destroyed during the Ardennes offensive in December and January. The battalion entered that battle with 45 King Tigers. By February, fewer than 10 remained operational, scattered among defensive positions, attempting to delay the inevitable Allied advance. The crew consisted of 4 men, reduced from standard 5 because replacements no longer existed. The commander had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, where he'd learned that technical superiority meant little if fuel exhaustion immobilized you or mechanical failure disabled critical systems. They carried 22 rounds for the main gun, less than half capacity. Only 8 were armor-piercing rounds for engaging enemy tanks. German ammunition production had collapsed under Allied bombing and advancing ground forces. Resupply had become impossible in any systematic sense. The fuel tanks held perhaps enough. Gasoline for 40 kilometers of road travel, substantially less cross-country. No fuel trucks were coming. When the tank ran out of fuel, the crew would destroy it and retreat on foot or surrender. German tank crews by February 1945 reflected the collapse of belief systems that had sustained them through years of combat. Early in the war, they'd fought with confidence from superior training and better equipment. By 1945, that confidence had eroded into fatalistic determination. They understood they fought for time, not victory. The Eastern Front had collapsed. The Western Front was collapsing. Allied air superiority was absolute. The strategic situation was hopeless, and most German soldiers understood this. Yet they continued fighting because retreat was impossible, because orders demanded it, because years of military discipline created behavioral patterns that persisted even when rational calculation suggested futility. The crew positioned their King Tiger carefully, using village buildings to protect vulnerable flanks while keeping the long gun oriented toward the most likely American approach. They would fight effectively because they were professionals. They would destroy American tanks because that was their function, and they had the technical means to accomplish it. Whether destroying 3 or 5 or 10 American tanks would alter the war's outcome wasn't a question they seriously considered. The war was lost. Everyone understood this. But the war continued, and therefore they would continue fighting until circumstances made fighting impossible. The village needed to be cleared before dark. The entire offensive schedule depended on it. Other units required the road network. Infantry was pinned down. Another Sherman had been knocked out. The situation was deteriorating, and the King Tiger represented the critical bottleneck. Lieutenant Bora understood the arithmetic with brutal clarity. Engaging frontally would accomplish nothing except revealing their position and drawing fire that would destroy them with the first shot. The German gunner would not miss at 200 meters. Maneuvering for a flank shot was impossible, given the village layout and the King Tiger's position. Calling for support meant waiting, and waiting meant accepting that the schedule would slip, that other units would be delayed, that men would die elsewhere because this village wasn't cleared when expected. The alternative violated every principle of armored warfare doctrine. It defied tactical logic. It was arguably suicidal, but it possessed one characteristic that made it theoretically viable. The King Tiger's crew would not expect it, could not anticipate it, and might not react quickly enough to prevent it if executed with absolute commitment. Bora's plan was simple in the way desperate plans are simple. They would charge the King Tiger directly at maximum speed. They would accept that the German crew would fire at least once during the approach. They would gamble that the first shot would miss or inflict insufficient damage to stop their momentum. And they would ram the German tank at sufficient velocity to disable it. Even if they couldn't destroy it, the physics were actually favorable in certain respects. The Sherman weighed 33 tons. At maximum speed, it would carry substantial kinetic energy. The King Tiger, stationary and positioned against buildings preventing rearward movement, would absorb the entire impact. Tank transmissions, final drives, running gear, all vulnerable to catastrophic impact damage. If they struck the tracks or running gear with sufficient force, they might disable the German tank's mobility even if the impact failed to penetrate armor or destroy internal systems. An immobilized King Tiger could be bypassed, destroyed by infantry with explosives, or engaged from flanks once the tactical situation changed. The risks were equally clear. The King Tiger's gun would certainly fire during the approach. At 200 meters, the German gunner could hardly miss. The 88mm armor-piercing round would penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor effortlessly, detonating ammunition, igniting fuel, killing the crew instantly, or incinerating them in burning wreckage. Even if the first shot somehow missed, the crew would experience the impact at high speed, potentially suffering fatal injuries from collision forces alone. The plan accepted near certain death as the probable outcome, while gambling that mission accomplishment might be achieved in the seconds before that death occurred. Bora explained the plan in brief, flat sentences over the intercom. There was no discussion, no debate about alternatives, no false optimism about survival probability. The crew understood exactly what they were being asked to do, and why conventional alternatives were unavailable. Roller's response was characteristically terse. Ready when you give the word, the gunner asked whether he should fire during the charge. Bora told him yes, not because it would damage the King Tiger, but because it might degrade the German gunner's concentration by forcing him to operate while incoming rounds struck. Near his position, the psychological state of men, choosing almost certain death for tactical objectives, transcends simple categories. Like courage or duty, they made their decision based on training that conditioned them to follow orders, experience that demonstrated the costs of hesitation, and perhaps some fatalism from 6 weeks of continuous operations, where death had become familiar enough to lose its power to paralyze decision-making. They were not heroes in the sense that term usually implies. They were exhausted men, executing what they understood to be necessary action, despite full awareness of probable consequences. Roller shifted into low gear, feeling the mechanical systems respond. The engine's note changed as he prepared to accelerate. The tank lurched forward, tracks biting broken pavement. Distance to the King Tiger, approximately 180 meters. At maximum speed, the charge would take 15 seconds. The German crew would have that much time to acquire the target, elevate the gun to correct range, and fire. For an experienced gunner, 15 seconds was more than adequate. The King Tiger's long barrel began traversing, tracking the approaching Sherman with mechanical precision. The German crew recognized the American tank's intention immediately. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. An American Sherman was charging directly toward them in violation of all rational tactical doctrine. They would destroy it at range, as they had destroyed numerous other American tanks. The mathematics supported their confidence. The Sherman covered approximately 60 meters before the King Tiger fired. The 8mm armor-piercing round left the barrel at over 1,000 meters per second, crossing the intervening distance in a fraction of a second that human perception could barely register. The projectile struck the Sherman's frontal plate slightly left of center, exactly where the gunner had aimed. The round penetrated the armor, but the penetration was not clean. The round struck at a slight deflection angle as Roller swerved fractionally while accelerating, just enough to alter the impact geometry. The projectile tumbled after entering the crew compartment, its energy dissipating in ways that deviated from optimal terminal ballistics. The round struck the transmission housing and detonated there rather than among the ammunition, storage or fuel tanks. Corporal Eugene Roberts, the bow gunner, died instantly. He had no time to register what happened. Roller felt the impact through the entire tank, felt metal fragments penetrate his left leg and lower back, felt the Sherman shudder and veer from the force of the internal explosion. But the engine continued running. The tracks continued moving. The Sherman maintained forward momentum, despite catastrophic damage and the loss of one crew member. Distance to the King Tiger, approximately 90 meters. The German crew was reloading. Extract the spent casing, load a new round, close the breech, elevate, acquire, fire. The process required perhaps 12 to 15 seconds with a trained crew. The Sherman would cover the remaining distance in approximately 9 seconds at current speed. The mathematics had shifted. The second shot would not come in time. The gunner fired the Sherman's 76mm gun repeatedly as they closed. The rounds struck the King Tiger's armor, creating flash and noise, but accomplishing nothing tactically except perhaps forcing the German gunner to operate while projectiles impacted near his position. Roller never reduced speed. Despite the pain from his wounds, despite knowing Roberts was dead, despite smoke filling the crew compartment, he kept the accelerator fully down and aimed directly at the King Tiger's left track assembly. The final meters passed in compressed time. The King Tiger filled his periscope view, individual details visible. The road wheels, tool stowage, the long barrel still traversing for a second shot that would not come. The Sherman struck the King Tiger at approximately 40 kilometers per hour, 33 tons of American tank impacting 70 tons of German armor at a velocity that translated into kinetic energy far exceeding what the King Tiger's suspension was designed to absorb. The collision was not a glancing blow. Roller had aimed precisely. The sound was a metallic shriek and grinding crash that seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously. The Sherman's frontal armor crumpled. The right track broke. The suspension collapsed. The tank's forward momentum arrested violently. Borer was thrown against the turret interior, breaking his collarbone. Farn struck the gun breech, suffering severe facial lacerations. McVeigh broke his nose and lost consciousness. Roller, braced in the driver's position, absorbed the impact through his legs and torso, fracturing his femur and suffering internal injuries from deceleration forces. The King Tiger's left track assembly disintegrated under the impact. The tracks broke. The road wheels shattered. The suspension failed catastrophically. The entire left side of running gear collapsed inward, settling the 70-ton tank onto its hull. More critically, the impact transmitted shock forces through the entire structure to the transmission and final drive, components already marginal under normal operation, that could not survive catastrophic overload. The German crew survived physically. The collision did not penetrate the fighting compartment, but the King Tiger was effectively destroyed as a combat vehicle in the seconds following impact. The tank could not move, could not traverse to engage other targets, could not retreat if the situation deteriorated. The German commander understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. The Americans had sacrificed a Sherman to disable his King Tiger through a method that German doctrine had never seriously contemplated. Deliberate ramming at high speed. The tactic was insane by conventional standards. Suicidal in its acceptance of near-certain casualties. and yet tactically effective in achieving the immediate objective. The German crew evacuated within minutes, following standard procedures. They placed demolition charges to destroy the gun and critical systems, preventing American recovery of a functional King Tiger for intelligence evaluation. The charges detonated as American infantry moved into the area. The crew retreated on foot through the village, eventually reaching German lines several kilometers east. The Sherman burned. The impact had ruptured fuel lines and fire spread rapidly. Borer, McVeigh, and Farn escaped through turret hatches, pulling Roller from the driver's position despite their own injuries and the spreading flames. Roberts's body remained inside. American infantry reached the scene within minutes, providing medical aid and evacuating the wounded to battalion aid stations. Roller was eventually evacuated through the medical chain to England, then to the United States for extended treatment. He survived the war but never returned to combat operations. The after-action report documented the engagement in bureaucratic language that conveyed tactical facts without capturing human dimensions. One Sherman had successfully disabled one King Tiger through ramming action. 1 soldier killed, 4 wounded. The tactical assessment concluded that while successful in its immediate objective, the action represented an emergency expedient that should not be considered standard doctrine. The engagement received minimal attention in official histories and press coverage. It was one incident among thousands during the final months. Individual tank engagements in obscure villages did not merit detailed coverage, but the tactical implications were significant. Other American tank crews facing similar situations in subsequent weeks occasionally employed ramming tactics when conventional engagement proved impossible and mission requirements demanded immediate action. They were never common occurrences, but they occurred with sufficient frequency to appear in multiple after-action reports from the final months of combat. Tank crews understood that ramming represented an option of absolute last resort, acceptable only when all conventional alternatives had been exhausted. The psychological impact on both American and German crews was more subtle but equally significant. American crews learned that technical inferiority did not necessarily mean tactical hopelessness. That creative employment of available assets could sometimes overcome performance gaps through unconventional methods. German crews learned that their technical superiority provided less security than doctrine suggested, that desperate opponents would employ tactics beyond conventional warfare parameters when circumstances demanded it. The broader strategic context mattered more than individual engagements. By February 1945, Germany had lost the war regardless of how many tactical victories individual German crews achieved. Allied industrial superiority, numerical advantages, and strategic position had rendered German defeat inevitable. Lieutenant Borer recovered from his injuries and returned home in April 1945, shortly before Germany's surrender. He received a Silver Star, though he rarely spoke about the engagement in post-war years. When interviewed by historians decades later, he expressed ambivalence, acknowledging tactical necessity while remaining troubled by the human cost. McVeigh and Farn both survived and returned to civilian life. Neither spoke extensively about their experiences. This was typical of combat veterans who had seen too much. The war was over. They had survived. The details of how survival had been achieved were not subjects for casual conversation. Sergeant John Roller spent 14 months in military hospitals. His left leg never regained full function. He walked with a pronounced limp for the remainder of his life. The internal injuries left chronic pain that worsened with age. He received a Silver Star and a Purple Heart. The decorations remained in a drawer, rarely displayed. Roller worked as a mechanic after the war, married, raised children, and lived an unremarkable civilian life that was nonetheless remarkable for the simple fact that he had survived circumstances designed to kill him. He died in 1993 at age 71, having outlived the war by nearly 5 decades, but carrying its physical and psychological scars until the end. The story of this crew illustrates fundamental truths about armored warfare that transcend specific technical capabilities or tactical doctrines. Superior equipment provides advantages, but does not guarantee victory when opponents prove willing to accept extraordinary risks to achieve objectives. The mythology of invincible superweapons collapses when confronted with mass production, numerical superiority, and opponents willing to sacrifice equipment and lives to overwhelm technical advantages through determination. The engagement also reveals the human costs of tactical decisions made under extreme pressure with limited alternatives. The decision to charge was tactically sound given the constraints, but it resulted in one man's death and severe injuries to 4 others. This was the calculus of command in combat, weighing mission requirements against probable casualties, accepting outcomes that peacetime moral frameworks would reject as unconscionable. The men who made these decisions and executed them lived with the consequences long after the war ended, carrying memories and injuries that shaped their post-war lives in ways civilians rarely understood or appreciated. The final months of World War II witnessed thousands of similar incidents, where exhausted men made desperate decisions because circumstances offered no better alternatives. Most were never documented in detail, never analyzed by historians, never commemorated beyond brief notations in unit logs. Yet collectively, these incidents represented the material reality of how wars end, through accumulation of small tactical victories achieved at costs that seem unbearable when examined individually, but become statistics when aggregated across thousands of engagements. The story ends where it began, with mathematical certainty colliding with human determination. The King Tiger's superiority was real, documented, undeniable. Yet superiority proved insufficient when confronted with opponents who calculated differently, who understood that one obsolete tank and 5 men's lives represented acceptable costs for removing one superior tank from the battlefield. This was not heroism in any comfortable sense. It was desperate pragmatism executed by exhausted men who understood that conventional rules no longer applied and that sometimes the only way to defeat superior technology is to break it through sheer physical force delivered with absolute commitment to action regardless of consequences. The Sherman burned. The impact had ruptured fuel lines and fire spread rapidly. Bora, McVeigh, and Farn escaped through turret hatches, pulling Roller from the driver's position despite their own injuries and the spreading flames. Roberts's body remained inside. American infantry reached the scene within minutes, providing medical aid and evacuating the wounded to battalion aid stations. Roller was eventually evacuated through the medical chain to England, then to the United States for extended treatment. He survived the war, but never returned to combat operations. The after-action report documented the engagement in bureaucratic language that conveyed tactical facts without capturing human dimensions. One Sherman had successfully disabled one King Tiger through ramming action. 1 soldier killed, 4 wounded. The tactical assessment concluded that while successful in its immediate objective, the action represented an emergency expedient that should not be considered standard doctrine. The engagement received minimal attention in official histories and press coverage. It was one incident among thousands during the final months. Individual tank engagements in obscure villages did not merit detailed coverage, but the tactical implications were significant. Other American tank crews, facing similar situations in subsequent weeks, occasionally employed ramming tactics when conventional engagement proved impossible and mission requirements demanded immediate action. They were never common occurrences, but they occurred with sufficient frequency to appear in multiple after-action reports from the final months of combat. Tank crews understood that ramming represented an option of absolute last resort, acceptable only when all conventional alternatives had been exhausted. The psychological impact on both American and German crews was more subtle but equally significant. American crews learned that technical inferiority did not necessarily mean tactical hopelessness, that creative employment of available assets could sometimes overcome performance gaps through unconventional methods. German crews learned that their technical superiority provided less security than doctrine suggested, that desperate opponents would employ tactics beyond conventional warfare parameters when circumstances demanded it. The broader strategic context mattered more than individual engagements. By February 1945, Germany had lost the war regardless of how many tactical victories individual German crews achieved. Allied industrial superiority, numerical advantages, and strategic position had rendered German defeat inevitable. Lieutenant Bora recovered from his injuries and returned home in April 1945, shortly before Germany's surrender. He received a Silver Star, though he rarely spoke about the engagement in post-war years. When interviewed by historians decades later, he expressed ambivalence, acknowledging tactical necessity while remaining troubled by the human cost. McVeigh and Farn both survived and returned to civilian life. Neither spoke extensively about their experiences. This was typical of combat veterans who had seen too much. The war was over. They had survived. The details of how survival had been achieved were not subjects for casual conversation. Sergeant John Roller spent 14 months in military hospitals. His left leg never regained full function. He walked with a pronounced limp for the remainder of his life. The internal injuries left chronic pain that worsened with age. He received a silver star and a Purple Heart. The decorations remained in a drawer, rarely displayed. Roller worked as a mechanic after the war, married, raised children, and lived an unremarkable civilian life that was nonetheless remarkable for the simple fact that he had survived circumstances designed to kill him. He died in 1993 at age 71, having outlived the war by nearly 5 decades, but carrying its physical and psychological scars until the end. The story of this crew illustrates fundamental truths about armored warfare that transcend specific technical capabilities or tactical doctrines. Superior equipment provides advantages but does not guarantee victory when opponents prove willing to accept extraordinary risks to achieve objectives. The mythology of invincible superweapons collapses when confronted with mass production, numerical superiority, and opponents willing to sacrifice equipment and lives to overwhelm technical advantages through determination. The engagement also reveals the human costs of tactical decisions made under extreme pressure with limited alternatives. The decision to charge was tactically sound given the constraints, but it resulted in one man's death and severe injuries to 4 others. This was the calculus of command in combat, weighing mission requirements against probable casualties, accepting outcomes that peacetime moral frameworks would reject as unconscionable. The men who made these decisions and executed them lived with the consequences long after the war ended, carrying memories and injuries that shaped their post-war lives in ways civilians rarely understood or appreciated. The final months of World War II witnessed thousands of similar incidents, where exhausted men made desperate decisions because circumstances offered no better alternatives. Most were never documented in detail, never analyzed by historians, never commemorated beyond brief notations and unit logs. Yet collectively, these incidents represented the material reality of how wars end, through accumulation of small tactical victories achieved at costs that seem unbearable when examined individually, but become statistics when aggregated across thousands of engagements. The story ends where it began, with mathematical certainty colliding with human determination. The King Tiger's superiority was real, documented, undeniable. Yet superiority proved insufficient when confronted with opponents who calculated differently, who understood that one obsolete tank and 5 men's lives represented acceptable costs for removing one superior tank from the battlefield. This was not heroism in any comfortable sense. It was desperate pragmatism executed by exhausted men who understood that conventional rules no longer applied, and that sometimes the only way to defeat superior technology is to break it through sheer physical force delivered with absolute commitment to action, regardless of consequences. Above Roller's position, Lieutenant Harold Borer stood in the turret commander's station, one hand gripping the cupola rim, the other holding the radio handset that connected them to company headquarters several hundred meters behind their position. Borer was 23 years old, though combat had aged him in ways that transcended chronological measurement. He had commanded this crew since Normandy, had made decisions that kept them alive through the breakthrough battles, through the race across France, through the grinding combat in the Siegfried Line fortifications. Now he faced another decision, perhaps the most consequential of his brief military career. The radio carried fragmented transmissions, voices distorted by static and distance. Someone reported tigers in the town square, though whether this referred to the King Tiger ahead or additional threats remained unclear. Another voice described a Panther tank knocked out near a church, its crew dead or captured. A third transmission reported infantry pinned down by machine gun fire from fortified positions. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, chaos replacing the orderly progression of offensive operations that higher headquarters had planned. This characterized the final push into Germany itself. Wehrmacht units fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, utilizing every remaining piece of equipment, every defensive position, every tactical advantage that terrain and urban environments provided. German soldiers knew the war was lost in strategic terms, but tactical resistance continued with undiminished ferocity. Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets appeared from basements and alleys, machine gun nests materialized in unexpected locations, and heavy tanks like the King Tiger ahead positioned themselves to inflict maximum casualties on advancing American forces. The disparity between the Sherman and King Tiger represented more than numerical differences in armor thickness or gun caliber. It embodied fundamentally different philosophies of armored warfare, different national strategies, different assumptions about how industrial nations fought modern wars. The Sherman weighed 33 tons, a medium tank designed for mass production and operational mobility. The King Tiger exceeded 69 tons, a heavy tank designed for individual combat superiority, regardless of production costs or logistical complications. The Sherman's frontal armor measured 63.5 millimeters on the glacis, angled at 47 degrees, with 76 millimeters protecting the turret front. These thicknesses provided reasonable protection against German medium tank guns and anti-tank weapons at typical combat ranges. But against the King Tiger's 88mm gun, Sherman armor might as well have been paper. The German gun could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, distances where the Sherman crew wouldn't even see the muzzle flash before the projectile arrived. The Sherman's own 76mm gun represented an improvement over the original 75mm weapon that had equipped earlier variants. The longer barrel and higher velocity gave the gun better armor penetration, allowing it to defeat German medium tanks like the Panzer IV and sometimes penetrate Panther tanks if striking from favorable angles. But against King Tiger frontal armor, the 76mm gun was essentially ineffective. The mathematics were unforgiving. Maximum penetration under optimal conditions might reach 90mm at 500 meters range when firing the special high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. The King Tiger's frontal armor exceeded 150mm effective thickness on the turret and approached 180mm on the glacis when, accounting for slope angle, every American tanker understood these figures. They had been briefed repeatedly on German heavy tank specifications. Training officers had explained the capabilities in explicit detail, ensuring crews understood exactly what they faced when encountering Tigers or King Tigers. The briefings emphasized doctrine: avoid direct engagement, call for tank destroyer support, maneuver for flank shots if engagement became unavoidable. Tank destroyers mounted 90mm or even 105mm guns specifically designed for defeating heavy armor. Let them handle the Tigers, while Shermans focused on their designated roles. But doctrine assumed tank destroyers would be available when needed. It assumed time existed to coordinate support. It assumed tactical situations offered options beyond immediate engagement. Reality frequently violated these assumptions. Tank destroyers were elsewhere when Tigers appeared. Time constraints demanded immediate action. Terrain or enemy positions eliminated maneuvering options. In such moments, doctrine provided no answers, leaving crews to improvise solutions that training manuals never addressed. Roller had joined the Army in October 1942, part of the massive expansion that transformed American military forces from a small peacetime establishment into a multi-million-man war machine. Fort Knox, Kentucky, served as the primary training center for armored forces, where recruits learned to operate tracked vehicles, maintain mechanical systems, and coordinate with other crew members. The training emphasized American armored doctrine, speed, mobility, combined arms coordination. Tanks were not supposed to fight other tanks in isolation. They operated as part of larger combined arms teams, working with infantry, artillery, air support, and tank destroyers to accomplish objectives through coordinated action rather than individual combat power. Roller's initial training occurred on M3 Lee medium tanks, vehicles already obsolete by 1942 standards. The Lee mounted its 75mm gun in a side sponson rather than a rotating turret, limiting firing angles and creating an awkward profile that made the tank difficult to conceal. But Lees were available for training purposes, allowing recruits to learn basic skills of tracked vehicle operation before transitioning to more modern equipment. Roller qualified as a driver, learning the characteristics of the Continental radial engine that powered most Sherman variants, understanding the vertical volant spring suspension that gave the tank its distinctive appearance, practicing maneuvers across varied terrain types. The training was abbreviated compared to peacetime standards. The Army needed trained crews immediately to meet deployment schedules for North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and the planned invasion of France. Training programs compressed instruction into shorter timeframes, accepting reduced proficiency levels in exchange for faster throughput. Roller received perhaps 8 weeks of formal training before assignment to a combat unit, supplemented by additional training with his specific crew before deployment overseas. By January 1945, when Roller's crew received their current tank, they had accumulated combat experience that no training program could replicate. They had fought across France from Normandy to the German border. They had engaged German armor, destroyed enemy positions, supported infantry attacks, withdrawn under fire, survived situations where other crews died. Combat provided education that peacetime instruction could never match, teaching lessons about mechanical reliability under stress, about human limitations when exhausted, about the narrow margin between survival and death in armored warfare. The crew consisted of 5 men whose continued existence depended on coordination achieved through repeated exposure to lethal circumstances. Lieutenant Bohrer commanded from the turret, responsible for tactical decisions, target selection, communication with other units. Corporal William McVeigh served as gunner, operating the 76mm main gun, the coaxial machine gun, the gun sights and range-finding equipment. Private first class. James Farn worked as loader, responsible for selecting appropriate ammunition types, loading rounds into the gun's breech, maintaining ready ammunition storage. Corporal Eugene Roberts operated the bow machine gun from his position in the front hull, also assisting Roller with navigation and observation. And Roller himself controlled the tank's movement, steering, shifting gears, accelerating and braking, positioning the vehicle according to Bohrer's commands. These 5 men lived in close proximity for weeks at a time, sleeping in or near the tank, eating rations together, sharing the confined spaces where personal privacy became impossible. They knew each other's capabilities and limitations, understood how each person reacted under stress, developed the intuitive coordination that allowed them to function efficiently during combat, when explicit communication was often impossible over the noise of engines, guns, and explosions. The M4A3E8 variant they currently operated represented the best Sherman available to American forces in early 1945. The designation indicated specific features: M4 hull design, A3 engine type using the Ford GAA V8 instead of the more common Continental radial, E8 suspension designation indicating the horizontal volute system that provided improved cross-country mobility compared to earlier vertical volute designs. The tank incorporated lessons learned from years of combat, including better armor layout, the more powerful 76mm gun, improved ammunition storage to reduce fire risk, better crew accommodations. Yet improvements remained incremental rather than revolutionary. The fundamental Sherman design dated to 1941 specifications, when American planners anticipated fighting German Panzer III and a 4th medium tanks, rather than the heavy tanks that subsequently appeared. By 1945, the Sherman was outmatched by German heavy armor in direct combat, relying on numerical superiority, tactical coordination, and crew determination to overcome technical disadvantages. Roller's crew understood their tank's limitations through experience rather than theoretical instruction. They knew the weak points on German tanks where armor was thinner or structural joints created vulnerabilities. They understood how to coordinate with other Shermans, using multiple tanks to attack simultaneously from different angles, forcing German crews to choose which threat to address while exposing flanks to another attacker. They had learned that patience often proved more valuable than aggression when facing superior German armor, that waiting for favorable circumstances was preferable to rushing into situations where technical disadvantages became insurmountable. By February 27th, they had been in continuous combat operations for 6 weeks, part of the 3rd Armored Division's advance through the Rhineland, following the breakthrough of the Siegfried Line fortifications earlier that month. The division now engaged in clearing operations through industrial towns and villages west of Cologne, encountering resistance that varied from token to ferocious, depending on local circumstances, available German forces, and defensive positions. These clearing operations were exhausting in ways that differed from mobile combat. Instead of advancing across open terrain, tanks maneuvered through narrow streets where buildings restricted fields of fire and concealed enemy positions. German defenders employed Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets extensively, weapons simple enough for untrained personnel to use effectively, deadly enough to disable or destroy any Allied tank if striking vulnerable areas. Every street corner represented potential danger. Every basement might conceal enemy soldiers. Every pile of rubble could hide explosive charges or anti-tank weapons. The crew was tired in ways that transcended simple physical exhaustion. They had spent weeks sleeping in brief intervals between combat operations, never achieving the sustained rest that human physiology required for optimal functioning. Maintenance occurred under field conditions with limited spare parts, often performed while exhausted, sometimes under enemy fire. Hot meals were irregular, dependent on supply lines that didn't always reach forward units. The psychological strain of repeated combat, watching other crews die in burning tanks, knowing that each engagement might be their last, this created cumulative stress that eroded judgment, slowed reaction times, increased error rates. Kroller's response, later documented in after-action interviews conducted months after the event, was characteristically terse and devoid of drama. Ready when you give the word, not heroic pronouncements or patriotic declarations, just acknowledgement that he understood the order and would execute it. McVeigh, the gunner, asked whether he should fire the 76mm gun during the charge. Bora told him yes, fire continuously during the approach. Not because it would damage the King Tiger, not because it would penetrate the armor or destroy any systems, but because it might degrade the German gunner's concentration or accuracy by forcing him to operate while incoming rounds struck near his position, creating flash and noise and dust that might fractionally degrade his firing solution. The psychological state of men choosing almost certain death for tactical objectives transcends simple categories like courage or duty or patriotism. These categories work well for public consumption, for decorations and citations, for memorial speeches and historical accounts, but they capture only partial truth about what men experience in such moments. Roller's crew made their decision based on multiple factors that operated simultaneously, rather than sequentially. Training had conditioned them to follow orders from legitimate authority. Experience had demonstrated the costs of hesitation in combat situations, where delays measured in seconds often meant the difference between survival and death. 6 weeks of continuous operations had created a kind of fatalism, where death had become familiar enough to lose its power to paralyze decision-making processes. They were not heroes in the sense that term usually implies, not men who chose danger from idealism, or sought glory through extraordinary action. They were exhausted soldiers, executing what they understood to be necessary action, despite full awareness of probable consequences. They were men who had survived this long, partly through skill, but largely through luck, who understood that luck eventually runs out, who perhaps felt that their survival time had already exceeded statistical probability. They were professionals performing assigned roles, because that was what professionals did. Regardless of circumstances, regardless of risks, regardless of outcomes, Roller shifted the transmission into low gear, feeling the familiar resistance of the shifter mechanism, hearing the change in engine tone as the Continental Radial responded to increased load. The Sherman lurched forward slightly as the clutch engaged, tracks biting into the broken pavement that characterized this village street. He could feel every mechanical system through the controls, through the floor plates, through his entire body. The tank had become an extension of himself after months of operation. Its responses predictable, its capabilities and limitations thoroughly understood. The distance to the King Tiger was perhaps 180 meters down a street that ran relatively straight between damaged buildings. At maximum speed, the charge would take approximately 15 seconds from acceleration to impact. 15 seconds during which the German crew would observe their approach, recognize their intention, follow established firing procedures, and engage with the main gun. For an experienced gunner with good optics and clear fields of fire, 15 seconds provided more than adequate time to acquire the target. Calculate range and lead angle. Traverse the gun to the correct position and fire,